Poverty is still a fact of life in both poor countries and in rich. Tonight in Copenhagen, we ask an outstanding panel of experts from around the world a very simple question. Why? Now, Sunita, over the past decade at least, we have seen political leaders from all the leading Western countries make climate change and resource depletion very salient political issues. Are they living up to their responsibility?
No, absolutely not. I mean, let's be very clear. Climate change is something which is increasingly becoming a threat across the world. It is making the poor more vulnerable, and yet we know all the way from 1992 to now, and especially the disastrous Copenhagen conference, politicians, particularly those from the richest part of the world, have never been able to walk the talk. And I think that is something we need to understand why, and we need to move ahead.
Friis, Bach, despite all the arguments, despite all the rhetoric of the past 10, even 15 years, nothing much has happened.
Well, yes and no. I believe it's a simplistic way of picturing the world today. If you look at it, obviously, rich countries have not delivered in terms of their international obligations and climate change. But I think today dividing it up in rich countries and poor countries is a notion of the past. There are rich countries that are moving forward. I hope Denmark is one of them. And there are rich people in poor countries that are not moving forward. Obviously, you need to work together in a much more nuanced way in a global community. And of course, we are to blame for climate change, for natural exploitation, and for some of the poverty. Rich countries have also developed windmills. They have developed vaccinations for poor countries and mobile telephones. You know, it comes as a package. And I think we have to break down the stereotype way of looking at the world and working. Those who want reforms, those who want to move forward, and those who don't.
But Minister, you cannot work together. You cannot build a cooperation at the global level unless countries that have made commitments, particularly when it comes to climate change. We have to understand climate change is one of the symptoms of developmental growth today. When countries like India ask for the right to development, they're not asking for the right to pollution. But that does mean that countries like Denmark, even Denmark, have to make much greater reductions and not look for cheap offsets to think that you can buy yourself out of pollution, which means that we're really talking about a different way of doing business and development, and that hasn't happened. And I think you cannot build cooperation unless we see meaningful change in the way we do development.
But insisting on making the same mistakes is not the solution either. And if you look 10 years from now or 20 years, countries like India and China will historically have polluted the most when it comes to emissions. You know, so talking about historic responsibility 10, 20 years from now, that will be a different question. And why make the same mistakes? Why not create the building blocks together?
This is very easy to say. You know, you can preach all you want and say, you know, we made the mistakes, but you shouldn't make the mistakes. But, you know, you don't have the resources to do renewable. We know that the answer to the world lies in doing a huge transition towards renewable energy. Yet we know that, and China is amazing in the way it is moving. India, my own country, is moving towards renewable perhaps as fast as it can. But the cost of the transition is high. We need to have development cooperation models which pay a feed-in tariff. You need a global feed-in tariff scheme. You need ways of being able to do that development with a difference. There's no point in preaching to us and saying, we don't make the same mistakes we did.
But I
you
agree.
Continue to make them.
Feed-in tariffs, global responsibility. Feed-in tariffs, global responsibility. Denmark, we have the most ambitious energy plan probably of the world, cutting 40% by 2020. But windmill technologies, energy efficiency, some of the significant investments, and we share and we develop together. Now, but the point is, definitely policy changes need to be made. Definitely. Energy subsidies, you know, 6 times.
But maybe Friis, maybe Denmark to some extent on this field is the exception that proves the rule. Because the pattern seems to be that the moment we were hit by the financial crisis in the United States, in Europe, the issue of climate change, the discussion about resources and so forth simply just fell off the agenda. Isn't the simple truth that as long as we are living with this financial crisis and the repercussions of it, we are not going to move on the issue of climate change in a more decisive fashion?
I think we will, because from a period where climate constraints and sustainable development was seen as a stumbling stone to development, it would be a constraint. Today it's a building block. And more countries are seeing it. Denmark investing in renewable energy, windmills, 40% of our electricity, and still
So you're saying
our
it is
electricity price is amongst the lowest in Europe.
So even in these trying economic times, we can still make the effort.
It's
that's
a
your
good
argument.
investment.
But-
It's a
but-
building block.
Sunita,
I
It's a
agree
building
with
block.
that.
Sunita,
I agree.
if
I
China
agree.
and if
Yeah.
India choose the path towards even further industrialization, even more globalization, even towards the kind of level of consumption that we have in this country, the simple fact will be that climate change will get worse. So right now
Absolutely.
and over the next 10 or 20 years, one could argue that you should go and have the argument with your own government, and really this is a choice for India and China to make.
No, that's just completely will not work. What you need is a formula to do both. You need to reduce in the rich world so that the rich world can show, lead by example, that it is possible to be rich without pollution. It is possible to reinvent growth which does not lead to the kind of catastrophe we're looking at. So you need to lead by example, but that does not mean that India and China should make the same mistake. That does, and I very strongly believe that India and China can do it differently. We haven't built all our power stations yet. We haven't got grid energy everywhere. We can build our houses more energy efficient. We can build our cities, which are based on public transport. We can do it differently.
Is there any doubt?
And that's what we need. We need cooperation, which is built on trust.
Friis
With the
Bach.
kind of global distrust that exists today, you will not get the kind of changes
Friis Bach,
we're
is there
looking at.
any doubt
On that we
as
agree.
to the fact that if we continue on the path that we are on now, we will see climate change, we will see catastrophes around the world, and the poor countries will bear the brunt of these problems?
I fully agree. And it's an enormous challenge for the world. And it's going to take significant efforts to solve it, and we have to work together in doing it. But I'm just, the blame game. I'm just saying, windmills and vaccinations and pollution and climate change. It is a global package now, and we have to find the fast movers and those who want to create different solutions. And they have to be found in India, in Denmark, and in Mozambique.
We have to find all the solutions, Minister, but we cannot do it by denying what is right and what is wrong. So we need politicians to stand up with countries like India against the United States and say, you have to lead by example.
All right.
And we say that every day.
Not enough.
All right. Thank you so much. And now, joining us on stage, another 4 panelists to answer a simple question. Will development aid alleviate poverty? Christian, if you stand here next to Sunita, and I would like to see on stage, next to Christian, Owen Barder, and on the other side, Alastair, Fraser, Linda Polman, and Dr. Evans. Now, Linda Polman, you have written extensively on the question of aid, on what you call the aid industry. What is wrong with development aid, the way we're giving it today and the way we have been giving it for decades?
It is industrialized. There's big aid is a multi-billion-dollar industry. 70 donor governments involved. $130 billion per year involved, and an estimated 50,000 NGOs involved. You can imagine that all these interests and all these agendas are colliding with each other.
But surely this is a good thing. You have got a lot of people working to alleviate suffering and poverty in the third world. They are spending a lot of money. All of that sounds good.
It sounds good, yes, but in practice there are plenty of problems there. One of the problems is that aid organizations and donors do not necessarily join one program. They're not necessarily working towards one goal. On the contrary, I would say most of the governments, most of your organizations are doing their own programs and not very much involved in cooperation with each other, which means that if there is development, it could have been a lot more if they would have coordinated.
So how bad is it, Linda Polman? Are we merely wasting money, or are we actually making problems worse?
In some cases, we are making problems worse. I mean, there are obviously, I'm not denying that aid is saving human lives, but lots more lives could be saved if money would be spent more wisely and more towards one communal goal. Why do we not have a program? Where do we want the world to be in 5 or 10 years? This is the problem. There is a lot of money involved, and the money is not being spent efficiently, and that is a waste of money.
Owen, Barder, isn't it absolutely true that there are many aid organizations, politicians and others who are involved with this, who do exactly what Linda Polman characterizes as being more concerned with their own projects and their own agendas than actually with the results that they create?
I don't think it is true. I know lots of people working in the aid system, both politicians and NGOs, who are very interested in producing results, and they've achieved enormous results over the last 50 years. We've had the most successful period in human history of getting people access to vaccinations, to safe drinking water, reducing maternal mortality, reducing infant mortality, reducing hunger. Now, it is true that we could improve the system more, and I think Linda's absolutely right to say that it would be good if we had a more rational system of organizations producing those goods and services. And one of the things that the aid industry has really tried to do is really try to address that, particularly by working much more with governments to bring together public services. But I think it's to say that because there are a lot of organizations working in this space, therefore it doesn't work, or therefore it's all a waste of money, is absolutely throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Linda Polman?
Like I said before, there have been results with aid, but there has always been this very dark side of aid, in which aid supports the wrong people. Aid supports certain elites that perhaps should not be there. Aid can be a contribution to war, to the length of wars and to the strength of wars. There are lots of dark sides to aid, and I do believe that the aid world should make a bigger effort to deliver on their promises. They owe it to the people and the countries where they are spending all that money to spend it as wisely as they can. The problem with changing the aid world is that most changes that are necessary, like cooperation and like coordination, it means that aid organizations and donors will have to deliver some of the freedom and the sovereignty they have now. Right now, aid is a free market. Every donor and every single aid organization can go to the country of his or her choice, do whatever they like, and leave whenever they believe that they're done there. If you would force aid organizations and donors to commit themselves to countries, to commit themselves to groups of victims, it would mean that they have to give up on some of their sovereignty. And this is why it is so hard to change the aid world. I believe that it is the duty of the public, of us, and of journalism to expose this and to help aid organizations and to help donors to perform better.
Christian Friis Bach, is this true?
Some of it is. I think we haven't been enough accountable to the people actually who are supposed to benefit from aid. But it's happening now. It's happening fast even. You have in Kenya people running around with mobile phones in health clinics and checking if the medicine is there and texting if it's not. You have school teachers who organize locally and demand that the school books arrive and that they get funds for a new roof and whatever, you know. So people are now increasingly engaging, participating,
but you're saying
and
now,
pushing
are you saying that essentially many of the criticisms that are made by Linda Polman were absolutely true 10 or 20 years ago?
Some of it, definitely, and not well enough organized. The Project Titis of the development aid was there.
The Project Titis, what is that?
That we all did individual projects, you know, in different parts of the world. It was definitely happened in villages. I've seen villages in Africa with 3 different extension services for farmers, and they didn't even have time to do their crops because they had to attend all the courses. And of course, that was not sufficiently coordinated. But now the farmers are doing it themselves.
Linda Polman.
Why is it so difficult for journalists, for scientists, to access information that is relevant for the entire aid industry? It is so difficult because there is no coordination, there is no central administration. All aid organizations can have their own administration. If I want to find out what the 50,000 aid organizations are doing, I would have to examine 50,000 of them and then try to gather a picture. There is no true accountability of what aid is actually achieving.
But they are not supposed to be accountable to you. They are supposed to be accountable to
the
people, that they are
it's
working
my money.
for.
It is our money. It is our tax money.
They should be accountable to those they try to help, and increasingly they are. Increasingly they are.
In
that's what creates
theory,
change.
aid organizations are much more aware that accountability is demanded of them by the public. That doesn't mean that the accountability is actually there.
All right,
It's
Sunita,
not.
please.
Just a quick issue, Linda, and I'm sure that's not what you meant, but you know, this whole, I keep hearing this, it's our taxpayers' money, and it's because of this syndrome that I believe a lot of the problems have come about, because aid has invariably tried to justify what it's doing to its own people without being able to really be accountable to the people on ground. If you're accountable to the people on ground, if you're supportive to what their aspirations are, you invariably will do development, it will happen over time, and then you can explain to people, but it's not a quick fix, and it isn't something in which you can go back to people and say, your taxpayers' money was spent to build a thermal power plant. It isn't as simple as that. So I think
if you don't have an independent outside controller of what the aid industry is actually doing, then there is no accountability. It will always be the butcher testing its own meat.
That's where, Linda, you're missing the point. I think the accountability will come from the nations themselves.
All right, Alastair,
I think
Fraser.
from the people who are receiving the aid from their democratic institutions, their media, their judiciary, their pillars of democracy need to be strengthened. Well, I am talking about all countries in the world. We should not be so patronizing to people. I think we are out there to work with them, not to think that they're helpless people who cannot fend for themselves. So I think there's an aid. The problem with the aid business is also that they don't look at human beings as human beings.
All right, Mr. Fraser, now the Western world, Europe, the United States, of course, has been giving out development aid over decades. How big a favor can one say that the rich countries have done the poor with aid?
How big a favor?
How big a favor?
That wasn't the point of aid. I think the conversation at the moment is confusing the idea of aid as if it's designed to create development in recipient countries. That's not the point of aid. That's not why it's given. It's always been given for a complicated combination of reasons to do with geopolitics, to do with ideology, to do with the effort to control the policy options.
So you are saying we don't give out aid to make life better for people in the poor countries?
No, I think it's a combination of factors. There are some very kind and generous people involved in the aid industry, but the overall logic of the system is to buy a place at the policy-making table in a recipient state and to override the sovereignty of developing countries.
So we buy ourselves influence?
We buy ourselves influence, and it doesn't work.
Friis, Bach?
We also do it because we have a genuine interest in combating poverty, for sure. And I think that has been there, and it has achieved enormous results, because vaccinating kids, is not something where you can see the geopolitics right around the corner, and getting them into schools and getting the health clinics out there, and enormous results has been done, for sure. We haven't been efficient enough in doing it, and we haven't been efficient enough at letting loose sometimes and building strong states and accountable societies and engaged people who can keep them accountable. That we haven't done sufficiently, building the institutions and the states. But
aid always does this. The aid agencies always tell you that the thing they did 5 years ago was disastrously wrong, but they've recently discovered the magic bullet. At the moment, the magic bullet is popular participation. The idea that it is in some way possible for a village dweller in Ghana to hold the UK government accountable for it's a ridiculous idea.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to meet Meagan Carnahan. Meagan, please come. Mrs. Carnahan, join us here on the floor. And tell us, very briefly, please, you are working with a group of people called Solar Mamas. Who are they?
They are grandmothers, illiterate grandmothers from rural areas in the developing world that we bring to India to train to be solar engineers.
Engineers. They go back to their villages and they do what?
They install solar electrification units in households and solar electrify.
Dr. Evans, does this work? Where we have grandmothers, they come to this college, the Barefoot College it's called. They are trained, they learn how to install solar panels. They are grandmothers, they go back to the villages. Is this how you create wealth and alleviate poverty?
Well, the best way of answering that, during the Second World War, the Red Cross went to Auschwitz. The SS put on a violin quartet at the gates, and the aid community disappeared, saying there's nothing going on here. It's a noble effort, but it's camouflage, and it's camouflage for dark forces, for governments, for state-funded NGOs often, for spying operations. Often the aid doesn't get down the food chain to the poorest people, and often it's the plaything of greedy, vote-motivated politicians. I think the minister would admit, that during the Cold War, most aid was the plaything, even the democracies, for geopolitical gains.
Friis?
I totally agree, and
Thank
I
you.
definitely.
So just to continue the point, because I didn't interrupt you.
Briefly.
In many countries,
so the point
yes.
is that, as Alastair said, it's always recently, things have changed, but it hasn't. And the real tragedy is aid is a complete diversion. The real issue should be trade. It's what Sunita said. It's taking people in these communities seriously.
All right, we'll talk about trade later. Let me just interrupt you there, because I need to know, Meagan, is this true? Are you doing no good whatsoever?
No, he's sitting far too long behind a desk and absolutely has no concept of what's going on the ground.
All right, explain it to him.
I think that the conversation of aid is one about aid that no longer takes into account the voice of the community and the grassroots population as to what solutions are going to work for them is not sustainable, and that is being proved out every single day. I also think the other conversation that has not been brought up by anybody so far today is the conversation of how much the real financial cost of poverty is to the world economy, and we cannot continue that. So unless we come together to find some solutions that both attack the problem from the ground up, as well as perhaps relooking at how better it can be attacked from the top down, we are not going to arrive.
All right, Frans, Mikael, Jansen, come and join us on stage. Please, Frans, Mikael, if you come here and you take this podium. I would like you to respond to the criticism from Alastair. He's saying that whenever we talk to an NGO, you guys have always come up with something you can do better. So if aid didn't work perfectly 10 years ago, now you have the solution for that. And if it didn't work perfectly 20 years ago, there was another reason for it. Is it true?
It's not true. But I think what I do, I believe that the power in people. It's people who are going to change the world and find new ways of doing development. So we take the point of departure in people themselves, in poor people themselves. And we link, as NGOs, we are not state, we are not companies, so we link people in solidarity and campaigning.
But then explain to us, if it's people themselves who start this process, if it's people who themselves continue this process, if it's themselves in these countries who create the results, why do they need you?
We are part of the people, aren't we? Because part of the things we do, I'm part of Action Aid Federation, global federations. So we work in Denmark to try to influence our politicians, the EU, to do something about the agricultural policy in Europe and so on, to try to get the governments of Europe to do something about the climate. That's our role. But we do that in linkages with and in solidarity with our partners in 40 countries in the world. That's what we do.
It's an incredibly tight circle, though. This idea that what you have is states and outside of them civil society and NGOs operating on behalf of the masses. It's a nonsense. What percentage of your money comes from official sources, comes from donors?
Well, in Action Aid International, it's less than 50% that comes
less than 50%. But that is a fairly significant bunch of your funding.
Much less than 50%.
Comes from the people that you tell me you're lobbying.
400,000 people in Europe directly, individually support Action Aid's work. It's in solidarity with poor people in the poorest communities. We work in 3,000 communities in the south, and that's those solidarity linkages we build.
Alastair?
I like the idea of building solidarity linkages. I like the idea of people-to-people connections. But there is an industry in the aid sector in which the staff change organization constantly from donor to state to civil society. The ideology is linked across all of them. They all work with basically the same idea, even if in slightly different organizations. It's circular.
This is an absolutely surreal conversation. Yes. Of course there are problems with the aid system, and there have been and will continue to be, but it's like saying that because there are problems with our education system, that means that we should shut down our schools. Of course we could do it better, but we have to look at the results that we're achieving.
But the fact is your system's killing people.
The aid system is not killing people. Not having aid aid would be killing
By
people.
not
The aid
having
system
trade.
is saving
One second.
millions of
And then
lives a year.
Dr.
It's giving people like... I was living in Ethiopia. In the last drought in Ethiopia in 2010, 2011, and the famine that we saw in 1982 when I was last living in Ethiopia was not repeated. Why? Because the Ethiopian government had been put in a position to give people access to food and to give people access to income when the rains failed. Over the border in Somalia, where there was no government system, there was famine. Why? Because of the aid system that put in
Dr.
the early
Evans,
warning
yeah.
system,
Dr. Evans,
provided
yeah,
the money, and
specifically,
that...
Dr. Evans.
The fact is that the aid system, time and
This
time again,
community
delivers. Yes, we could make it better.
Dr.
Yes,
Evans.
we could make it better, but don't use those criticisms to suggest
right.
the whole system.
This
doesn't
system
work.
couldn't even sort out Haiti. While we're standing here talking, okay, there are reports out there that look at the human cost just of EU trade barriers to sub-Saharan Africa. The cost of not having trade, fair, free trade, is one human life every 13 seconds.
Nothing to do with aid.
Why?
Nothing to do with aid.
But the
Not
point
the
is,
issue.
why isn't Bob Geldof, why isn't Bono, why isn't the aid industry
But I'm sure-
lobbying the EU
We
what
are.
in the next
That's
10
what my
years
organisation
so they can
does.
win?
That's
Why
what I
isn't-
do for a
why-
living.
Why aren't this community demonstrating outside the Farmers' Union in London?
We
outside
are.
the Farmers' Union
That's
in
exactly what we're doing.
Ladies and gentlemen,
That's exactly what we're doing.
Every day.
Order. Now, Friis, I'm sure if I ask you why aren't you working to eradicate trade barriers, as Dr. Evans suggests, you will say that you are. But the point is this, isn't it absolutely true, and Dr. Evans does have a point here, as does Mr. Fraser, that the question of free trade and the question of sort of the real money flows in the global economy are far larger than development aid. The significance of them is far greater.
Many more lives
I'm
to
sure,
save.
One second.
but before becoming a minister, I was a trade economist. And the lecture number one in any trade economy course is comparative advantage can bring global gains, but they will only be redistributed fairly if you have a redistribution mechanism behind it. It's Adam Smith, it's the first lecture, and it's David Ricardo and all of it. You know, you have to have a distribution mechanism as well as trade. Nigeria traded enormous amounts of oil and
So
got
which
no
decade are we
richer.
going to get the trade minister? Which decade? This, the next
There
three?
is trade ministers. We have trade barriers in Europe have been brought down significantly, and in the world, and I've been following WTO negotiations for 25 years, they have achieved results. I'm a free trade fanatic, you know, but it's not going to solve the problems. You
All right.
can't solve the problems by free
Been
trade
bringing
alone.
it down.
That's it.
How,
it's course number
how
one.
far have we got to go? We've got
All
a
right.
long way
Three
to go,
rounds of
haven't
Friis
we?
as we shall return.
Trade shall definitely increase, but you cannot go without aid as well, because trade is
got
not
a long way to
going
go. We've got
bring
decades
schools.
of
We shall
negotiations.
return to the question of the free market funds. Mikael, final word.
Well, aid has a place to work. I mean, it does certain things. It doesn't change the whole equation. What we're saying is we need to change the rules of the game. This is only the people who can change the rules of the game, and that's the path we're on. That's why we are moving and making claims to our minister and to the EU and so on, and working more and more and increasingly as an international force to demand a change of the rules of the games, those rules that keep poor people poor.
All right, final question in this round, Linda Polman. Do you see the aid industry changing? Do you see that there's been the kind of paradigm shift that Owen Barder and Friis Bach acknowledged? There has been change going on, and many of the criticisms and the observations that you've made have basically been addressed.
Well, what makes me always quite sad about aid is that they don't need me, they don't need us to tell them what is wrong, because you've analyzed all the problems yourself. It's all there, stacks and stacks and stacks of evaluation of what went wrong this time and your good solutions about what will go right the next time, and it doesn't happen. So the talk up of change is always greater than actually taking up the change. And this has to do with the fact that the aid industry has something to lose with change. Yes.
And that will be the final word in this session. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Evans, you will remain standing. Everyone else, please take a seat. Professor Wilkinson, come and join us. Now, for the next few minutes, we are going to talk about poverty in the rich countries. Now, Professor Wilkinson, you have written a book on equality. Tell us, what is so great about equality?
Almost every health and social problem seems to be reduced in more equal societies. So if you compare more societies with bigger income differences, like the United States and Britain, with Scandinavian countries or Japan, the more equal
No,
ones,
let's stay with Scandinavia. What is so great about Scandinavia, sir?
you find that they have much higher life expectancy than the United States. They have lower homicide rates. They have fewer teenage births. They have higher standards of child well-being. They have stronger community
And-
life.
and this
All
is-
these things
all right.
are really good measures of them.
And the point is, this is not just because we are rich, it is because we are equal.
Yes.
How do you know?
These measures are unrelated now in the rich countries to GNP per capita, and there are many studies which control for individual income and look at the effects of inequality
So
on
you're
these
saying
outcomes.
the Americans are very rich, but they aren't as equal and they don't live as well
They
as we
have
do?
the lowest life expectancy in the developed world almost. They have the highest obesity rates, they have the highest prison populations, they have the highest homicide rates. And you take countries with slightly less inequality and they're a bit better on all those things. The next
And you are saying essentially that a more equal society is a better place to live, and it's also a society that can adapt in time of crisis.
Yes, they're more flexible, more adaptive, because they're more cohesive. They're also marginally more innovative than more unequal
Now,
societies.
Dr. Evans Wilkinson insists that he can demonstrate on a number of accounts that the greater equality a society is able to exhibit, the better it is. Is it true?
Well, the people in North Korea, I lived in Czechoslovakia for a time when I was senior advisor, clearing up the mess of an equal society under communism. They would disagree. Their mortality rates, suicides are much higher. Look, statistics are great things. I'm a sociologist, I get this. Everyone who I know who's died of cancer wore shoes at some point. Is there a causal relationship? No, no, it's not a flippant point. Richard believes that
it's extremely flippant.
I'm sure you do. No, I'm sure for your career in your university you do. But I'm not sure inequality is the issue that we should be focusing on. I think the key issue is poverty. The key issue is poverty. And the fact is that we see in Greece, we see in Spain, we see in Italy, we see the public sector get into grave difficulty this Christmas in the United States with the fiscal cliff. What we're seeing is the old model of politics starting to get into trouble. And I'm afraid the conversation about inequality is going to quickly get overwhelmed.
So you're saying, Dr. Evans, that as long as we are dealing with an economic crisis at the size of which we are in now, we shouldn't worry about equality.
I mean, I come from Britain, and my public sector is already starting to default.
All right.
Yeah? Cuts are being made, pensions are coming later. These nations are in grave trouble. The real issue is poverty. There are people starving
Professor
tonight
Wilkinson,
in Greece.
what about this point? Essentially, Dr. Evans is saying we don't have enough money to worry about equality at the moment. Right now, we should worry about poverty and the repercussions of the crisis.
Our present crisis, the crash in 2007-8 and the crash in 1929, were both peaks of inequality and peaks of indebtedness. The two go together. If you're only interested in preserving a free market, you should be in favor of greater inequality. It's a greater
So
equality.
are you saying that inequality led to the financial crisis?
Yes, it was one of the things
Dr.
that led
Evans?
to it.
Well, of course, the sad reality is we don't have a free market. What we have is crony capitalism. What we have at the heart of our financial system is nationalized, centralized banks. They have monopoly currencies. You have central committees in our banks that set interest rates. This bubble was created mainly by the US Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and others, keeping interest rates preposterously low in the 90s.
I mean, one thing is the current situation and the current crisis, but do you deny, Professor Wilkinson's more general point, that equal societies are happy societies, people live healthier lives, they live longer lives, essentially equality is a great thing?
Richard's research is mainly with what were rich Western countries. What he hasn't looked at, of course, is communist countries. He can't even get into North Korea. There, I think inequality there, when it's really truly imposed, is a murderous and totalitarian thing.
So you're saying essentially, Dr. Evans, that any effort on the politicians' part to create more equality or make people more equal will lead us to what? North Korea?
Yeah, but now the financial crisis in the West is so great. It's so great. For example, in Greece tonight, they're not interested in a debate about inequality. They're trying to get food tonight.
Yes, but that is nowhere near an answer to my question. I'm saying if the
I've got to live in the real world, haven't I, as it is tonight.
Yes, but if the politicians try to create a more equal society than, say, Great Britain is today or the United States, will they end up with North Korea? Could they end up somewhere
logically,
else?
if you just have ever higher taxes, ever more draconian measures to force people to be equal, you don't end up in Sweden. At the end of the day, you go into the law of diminishing returns.
Professor Wilkinson, isn't it absolutely true that the European welfare states, the generous welfare states, Germany, France, the Scandinavian countries, many of those countries that show up in sort of in the good end or at the top of your surveys, they have tremendous problems now sustaining these societies, sustaining the kind of equality that you rave about.
They're not the countries that are in the real economic mess as a result of the financial crash. They're nearly always doing much better than those countries. I think the
That's not true.
relationships are quite
So you are
clear.
saying essentially that your research indicates that equality has equipped us to deal with the crisis.
I think it makes because it makes a society more cohesive with fewer internal problems. It's a better society, more adaptable in all sorts of ways. The opposition to the cuts and so on, the political conflict in many societies dealing with the financial crash is added to because people see the rich incomes going on up even when unemployment is increasing and real wages in the public sector being cut. It's much harder to tolerate any of that.
When Germany tonight has a debt of 85% of GDP for its government, when the Japanese government is 200% in debt, when America is 104%, when the backdoor liabilities in Germany are probably more than 2 trillion, you are in an unspeakably risky world.
But Dr. Evans, Professor Wilkinson's point is that inequality got us precisely
a driver
into
of debt.
that mess.
Great. It's a great conversation to have in the 1970s, but it's not going to help the Greek people starving tonight or the unemployed in Spain.
All right, Professor Wilkinson.
What happened when the top income started to run away from the rest of us, which is why our societies mostly have become more unequal, is what's called people's aspirational incomes. If I ask you, how much more would you like to need to live the sort of life you'd be happy living? People used to say perhaps 20 or 30% more, sometimes 50% more. When income differences rose because top incomes were running away, people suddenly started to say they needed twice as much.
Look, Richard, I'm a sociologist.
And that is why people took out more debt.
I'm a
to
sociologist.
keep up with each other.
My wife works in the NHS in Britain, our state healthcare system.
Sure.
The NHS is the class system. There are mainly white, middle-class doctors at the top, with often black women at the bottom. The difference in salary there is often 15, 20-fold, okay? And even worse, if you're an unskilled manual worker in Britain and you go to the NHS, you will receive, on average, 40% less resource per illness episode than someone in the middle class.
Maintains inequality.
The idea that politicians could even deliver inequality doesn't even get off the ground often.
Professor Wilkinson.
That is quite wrong. The private sector has much, much bigger pay differentials, 10 times as big. And in the multinationals, you find pay ratios within them of 200, 300, sometimes 500 to 1. In the public sector, it's almost never more than 20 to 1, and usually more like 12 or 15 to 1.
Professor Wilkinson.
Much smaller. It's quite wrong to suggest the public sector is the problem driving inequality.
The idea that most of the global corporations are a product of the market and not crony capitalist state power,
we shall return to the market
that's a real
in a
joke.
moment, Dr. Evans. Now, Professor Wilkinson, the last and final question for you. Now, if it is true, let's say that you're absolutely right, equality is great, the more equality we have, the better it is. What I think governments are facing around the world is that when they try now to make societies more equal by increasing taxes on the rich, for instance, they are met with the argument that the rich will simply move. In other words, the kind of equal societies that we might have had in Western Europe over the past couple of decades are simply not sustainable. Because of globalization, the rich, if we try to tax them more, will move away.
Well, firstly, I think we must deal with the tax havens that allow people to avoid taxation. It's absolutely scandalous that the rich and large corporations so often avoid tax.
But if we can't do that,
but there are other
gone,
ways, not only of increasing taxation, but we can reduce income differences before tax. By having more employee representatives on board, on company boards, by having more democratic economic institutions, like mutuals, friendly societies, cooperatives, employee-owned companies.
Do you acknowledge that in the era of globalization in which we are living now, it has become absolutely more difficult to maintain an equal society than it was 20 or 30 years ago?
Because it's easy to avoid tax, which makes most countries worry about putting top tax rates up.
And because people move, don't they?
But it needs an international effort to deal with those tax havens. It doesn't matter if they move. We can replace these people. It's completely wrong to think that talent is so rare and that there are some people who are brilliant and other people who just, the rest of us aren't. They're not a superior race.
It's good to have...
All right. Dr. Evans.
It's amazing when you live in Eastern Europe and the collapse of communism to be back with a good old-fashioned utopian communist. I congratulate you.
That's
it's brilliant.
Absolutely baloney.
All right, that will be
I've
the
spent time
final
studying what
point.
happened to health
I know
in
you're an
those
expert.
parties.
I know you're an
Dr.
expert.
And
Evans,
what's happened to
Professor Wilkinson. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Dr. Evans, you will remain standing. Professor Wilkinson, please take a seat.
Thank you.
And now I would like to welcome onto the floor Christian Friis Bach once again. Henrik Skovby, if you will join Tim on this side, and on the other side, once again, Sunita, Owen, Barder, and Fraser. Mr. Fraser, please join us here. And now, we are going to talk about an issue that we began to discuss a few moments ago. We are going to talk about trade. We are going to talk about the future of the world, nothing less. And we are going to talk about the rise of new global players. And let's start with them, Christian Friis Bach. What difference does it make to the world that China and India and other economic powers are now rising? What difference does it make, say, to Africa that China is now a major player?
I think there's a lot of positive signs and a lot of investments coming in China that we definitely should appreciate and acknowledge as positive steps. I just come from Mozambique, though, and there are also concerns, land being taken, people being pushed out. You could see timber being shipped out in big amounts, illegally often, and there are issues of taxes and employment conditions. But I definitely believe that an internationally engaged China, India, Brazil is to the benefit of us all.
So you are saying that everything that you are seeing out in reality is bad news, but it ought to be good news.
There are also very positive investments, but I see we just need to make sure that the benefits created by Chinese investments also accrue to the people where they are investing, and that's a big challenge, and that has to do with the proper environment. It has to do with proper land rights so people are not pushed away. It has to do with taxing the mineral resources and the oil and the gas that Mozambique is now discovering big time, and making sure that the benefits go to the people in Mozambique.
You're working with development, you know a lot about it. Tell us, will the rise of China and the Chinese interest in Africa help these countries?
I think so. I mean, what you're seeing today is that China is actually investing more in China than they're investing in the EU. Mm-hmm. And China is building a lot of infrastructure that is very, very helpful for Africa, and they're providing a growth story for Africa. And if you look upon the extractive industries, today you're still seeing that the main companies that are extracting oil and minerals out of Africa, they're not from China, they're still from the US and Europe.
Alastair, Fraser, is this true? Is this an opportunity for Africa that China shows the kind of interest that the country does now?
I think it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity principally because the dominance of Western institutions and Western companies has done very little to help Africa. And thus having a competitor and for an African state an alternative to turn to is a very positive thing.
Are you saying that the African countries today in 2012 are still being exploited by the West?
They're being exploited by the West and they're being exploited by China. That is the nature of capitalism. It's entirely unsurprising. The point about the sort of anxieties we see from some Western commentators, the minister hasn't expressed it in its most anxious form, but Hillary Clinton would, to sort of fear a new colonialism or a new scramble for Africa in which the Chinese play the role of some sort of corrupt, twisted, dark version of the positive Western investment. I think is entirely mistaken. The reason why Chinese companies are able to exploit Africa is because Western aid donors have pushed an agenda of deregulation, privatization, shrinking the state, removing all possibility of controlling these companies. And so, yes, Chinese companies are doing terrible things in Africa, so are Western companies. Guess what? We live under capitalism.
All right, Professor Hansen, please join us. Holger, where are you? There you are, sir. Please come and join us on stage. Now, if you walk to the podium, tell us, is this true? Is Alastair right in saying that the reason that the Chinese can have a field day now and the reason that they offer some hope for Africa is essentially that they give the African countries a choice? Now they can choose to whom they should exploit them, essentially. They have a choice.
Yeah, you can quite, you see that quite often. I listened to the Kenyan foreign minister just a few weeks ago, and he said that he preferred that China and other new donors acted on their own, not in company with the traditional donors, but so they like this alternative too, and also to play them out against each other.
All right, is this true, Friis Bach? We heard Alastair saying that essentially the reason that the Chinese have something to offer the African countries is that the African countries, even today in 2012, are still exploited by the West, and now they have two major powers, just as Professor Hansen is saying. They can now choose whether to call Brussels or Washington or indeed Beijing.
And I think that is healthy, I agree. But I also see many African countries now...
Is it healthy that they're being exploited?
It's healthy that there are competitors on the global scene, that we are having a diverse international environment. You know, I think and African countries can take choices of their own. I think that is healthy. That's what needs to be happening. But the African countries are also now putting up resistance to some of the Chinese, the Chinese companies coming with all their workers. I've seen it all over Africa. They're coming with all their workers, constructing it and leaving again, and no works are left behind, and no real impacts are there. African countries are counter-arguing that as well and saying to the Chinese, we want you to benefit, and they're saying it to us. So that kind of pressure from African countries themselves to get a bigger share of the natural resources and whatever, is definitely healthy.
Sunita, is it basically true that African countries, like Alastair described it, are now going from an era of being exploited by the West to an era of being exploited by the Chinese?
Well, the entire global development model is based on extraction of resources, and Africa is the place where you now have mineral resources that can be extracted as cheaply as possible to build the wealth that we need, to build all the consumer goods that we need in the world. But I think the only good thing that could come out of this would be if the African people would have the rights and the voice to be able to demand what they want. If they can say that if you want our mineral wealth, then we need benefits, not just the elite governments, but also, or not just governments. I think the word elite is also something that we need to use carefully, not just elected governments, but also the people on the ground, the local communities who are affected by mining, by all the shell companies, extremely exploitative practices
Sunita, when
in
you look
Nigeria.
to the experience, China has been now working in Africa for a few years, so we don't need to speculate. We can look at the results there. And does it seem to you as if Africa is being exploited by the Chinese?
I think Africa has been exploited by everyone.
All right.
And I think Africa will stop being exploited by everyone as soon as the people in Africa have a voice to say what they want.
Owen, Barder, please, sir.
And they do. I think this is a very out-of-date conversation. Africa is rising. It has the fastest growing economies in the world, and not just because of mineral resource extraction, but because they have a dynamic labor force. They're increasingly connected because of their skills and their education, partly as a result of our investment in foreign aid over the years. The idea that we're all talking about Africa as if they're pawns on a chessboard, where Washington or Brussels or China is moving them around without recognizing the agency and the growth and the dynamism of that continent. They're making choices about Chinese investment and about European investment. Let me give you one example. Sure. A British company that used to make shoes in the west of England has now moved to Ethiopia, where I used to live, which has a traditional industry of making leather. They've employed 700 people in Ethiopia using the traditional African skills in Ethiopia making shoes, and they're exporting those shoes to China. Africa is growing not just because of exploitation of natural resources, but because they have the most dynamic, fast-growing economy, and we should welcome that. And the question about China should be, why aren't we investing in Africa in the same way that China is?
All right, here's Skovby.
Let me just nuance the point a bit, because I agree overall. If you look upon Africa, you're basically dealing with three types of countries. You have weak, failed states, you have a number of less developed countries, but then you have around 10 to 15 countries that are doing extraordinarily well. Growth rates 5, 7, 8, 10%. And in those countries, what you're seeing is, as Owen is pointing out, you're seeing a lot of vibrant business communities emerging. And a lot of that is not built on mines and so on, it's actually commercial activities from agriculture and so forth. And I'll give you a small anecdote that I think is pretty interesting. I was sitting a few months ago in Africa with 5 or 6 leading CEOs on the continent. The conversation we had there was, how could they get funding from China, funding from the Gulf into their countries? They were talking about how could they get technology from India into Africa. They were talking about how they could replicate e-government at Cape Verde. They were talking about how to create the financial institutions as in Mauritius. They're role models now from the South. They're not from the EU anymore. And that is the change that is going on. There's a transformation going on right now where Europe is not only in a crisis, we're seeing a transformation globally.
So
where Africa is taking advantage.
What does this mean, Friis Bach, in the longer term? What does that mean for human rights? What does it mean for democracy? What does it mean for equality in the longer term in Africa? If they're calling up Beijing, if they're calling the Gulf countries, if they're getting money from these places, they might get ideas from those places as well.
And it also means they have a say on their own, you know, and I totally agree on that. And that goes for the business community. It also goes for civil society actors, you know. You see it all over Africa, you know, hundreds of local civil society organizations coming up, fighting for women's rights and education, and fighting for environment and distribution and welfare schemes and equality and all of it, you know. And they are there, and it leaves me with a lot of optimism when I meet them, you know, and they are there as well.
One of the crucial aspects, and it's missing from the conversation so far, I don't think it's particularly controversial, but one of the things Africa really has to push now, because of the huge opportunities, and I completely agree, is property rights. And not just property rights in the person, that people have the right to their own life and their own liberty and their own sexuality and all those things, but they actually have the right to the fruits of their own labour, including land rights. These are very important. These proprietarian rights for individuals and for cooperatives and voluntary collective groups are vital. And property rights have all too often been missing in the developing world, and it's something that really has to be pushed.
But if you've got no money, Dr. Evans, if you've got no money with which to buy, you know, a mine, and it will be swallowed up by the Europeans or by the Chinese, you know, what good
But
does
we know,
rights
don't we? We
do?
know from Southeast Asia, from its development since the 50s, if you go the free trade route and you institute property rights in and of the person and you follow the civil liberties, and you're open to trade, look at Hong Kong, then you're going to make it.
All right.
We're not disagreeing here.
Let's
this
stay
is
with
not a
that
great
point.
controversy.
Professor Tarp, please join us here. Professor Tarp, Finn Tarp, working in Finland, an expert in development economics. Now, you know a lot about development. And essentially what I'm hearing from several of these people is that China is there, many African countries, Henrik Skovby has just made this point, they are moving ahead, they are sort of jumping on the globalization bandwagon. Does this mean, Professor Tarp, that we should no longer discuss aid, we shouldn't plan more aid, that from here on it is all about trade and investment?
I think that would be a mistake. I tend to think that it's nice to walk on two legs. It's somewhat difficult to just hump on one. And it's more effective. You get further ahead. Trade and aid functions like that. Why should I just use one leg when I can have two?
But essentially,
then, if I may add, it has been shown that trade promotes development. It has been shown that aid is good investment and promotes development over the long run.
Dr. Evans, you just made the point that Africa should follow Southeast Asia in going the free trade route. They should develop their own industries and so forth and basically trade their way to wealth. But doesn't Professor Tarp have a point here? When you look at Africa the way Henrik just described it, there are countries that still need aid. And to say that we want free trade and we want to do away with trade barriers shouldn't be the same as saying that there's no need for development aid also in 5 years' time or 10 years' time.
Yeah, well, Southeast Asia, of course, got there with two legs, 10, a billion, a lot quicker than simply the slightly imperialist route and the slightly paternalistic, and by all accounts it was all failing, was it, until 5 years ago, the hundreds of billions of pounds that have been blindly spent on
So are you saying
I understand and I hear and I understand from the minister that it's all getting better now and it's going to be great in the future.
Are you saying that all the billions of pounds or American dollars or whatever currency you want, are you saying that it has all been wasted on aid?
I'm afraid if you look at poverty levels in sub-Saharan Africa and you look at the death rates, look at the amounts of money that have been wasted. If only we'd gone the Southeast Asian route, we could have saved hundreds of millions of lives.
Owen Barder?
Go and talk to Korea about the aid they received from the United States that put them on the path to growth.
And is there not an aspect of crony capitalism in the growth of most of the Southeast Asian countries?
There is indeed, and that's one of the things that concern me. I mean, when I was a young man, when I was your age, Japan was going to be the future. This blind assumption that China is coming to the rescue, I don't know. It makes me nervous.
Didn't Owen Barder just make the point that Korea, one of your examples, indeed did benefit from aid?
It was a lot less aid proportionally than the year in, year out.
But per capita was much more.
It was a quick and dirty injection that was tied to key reforms that had property rights at their centre.
So you have no problem, Dr. Evans, with quick and dirty injections.
I think it's if you have an emergency, then the state can provide emergency aid. But when it goes over the decades, it's ludicrous.
Okay, Professor Tarp, please.
Vietnam was in absolute term, largest recipient of foreign aid in the beginning years of the last decade. The absolute largest aid recipient in the world. Nobody with a sound sense somewhere in the back of their mind would argue that poverty has not fallen very drastically in Vietnam.
All right, we've just got a couple of minutes left. Alastair, Fraser, I want to return to you. Because is it possible to imagine that China will make the kind of investments that China is making in Africa at the moment without expecting something in return? Is it possible to imagine that the African countries will benefit from Chinese investments without China making its interests felt?
So far, I think there's strikingly little evidence of that. There is an idea that some Chinese aid comes conditioned on recognition of the Chinese position on Taiwan, but beyond that, the track record of conditional aid is that's what we do. Right? The West has a deep fantasy that by attaching our values to aid, by insisting that people sign up to our favored policies, they will benefit.
So
China's shown very, very little interest in doing that.
So is that true, Friis?
It's true they haven't interfered the way, definitely, and they still insist on that. I've just been to China, but they are also changing their options, and they are reaching out to a global community now and seeking cooperation. But I'd just like to say also to Dr. Evans, nobody has argued that trade is not a good idea. It is, and I'm a big trade fan and free trade fanatic. But you need redistribution. In Denmark, we have a big redistribution between. In Denmark, we have redistribution between municipalities.
And we're still not there.
In Denmark, we have it. In Europe, we have it. In the US, you redistribute between the municipalities and the areas that do well and those who don't do well. We need it globally as well. It's not something artificial. It's not something of the past. It's something of the future as well.
How many millions do you think have died because of the lack of free trade?
I have not argued against free trade at any point. I just say you cannot solve the world's problems by free trade alone. It's never going to make it.
Free trade may be a problem. Free trade may also just be a big problem for the world today.
I think that we should take into account that, of course, China serves its own interests by involving themselves in Africa, just like we have done with our aid and with what we are doing else now. Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya, said it's naive to believe that the East aren't coming with the same interests as the West. So
but essentially, if Alastair Fraser is right, and he's saying he doesn't think that the evidence has borne this out so far, couldn't you imagine that if you are an African country and you can call the Americans, or you can call the Europeans, or you can call the Chinese, you can say, look, we don't want your ideas, and your notions and your norms about sexuality or good governance or whatever, we don't need it, we just want the money. So essentially, couldn't China be Africa's way out of trying to follow somebody else's agenda?
China does it more than we do. You have free lunches or free money, but they are, as the minister has just said, they are moving, that they don't want these free lunches all the time anymore.
Sunita, is it just a question of time before China says, now we've made the investments and we want something in return?
No, I don't think that's the issue. I think the fact of the matter is, whether it is China or whether it is any other agency, the kind of development that will happen in Africa, unless the people in Africa have the right to say yes or no to it, there will be huge challenges for the future. We will see more inequity grow, you will see more tensions grow, which is why, whether it is the Chinese or whether it is a Danish company, it is the people in Africa who must have the right to tell the Danish company or the Chinese company.
But essentially, does the responsibility, and this will be the final question of the night, Sunita, does the responsibility for alleviating poverty in Africa now rest solely and squarely with the African governments? Because if we are saying we can no longer force our values and our notions on them because the Chinese are there, it must be all up to them, right?
It's up to them, but we all have to be role models. We need to work with them as supportive agents, as enablers, but it is their responsibility. We cannot run Africa for them.
All right, that will be the final word tonight. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. That is it. That brings us to the conclusion of this Why Poverty debate from Copenhagen. Good night.